Picture a room you know well. A break room, a shared office, a group chat that used to ping every few minutes. Now picture the moment the messages stopped. Not because of a fight, just a slow cooling, like a window left open overnight. And by morning, everything in the room is a few degrees colder than it should be. Here's what nobody tells you about that feeling. It might be the most backwards compliment you've ever received. I want to talk to you about something that Nietzsche spent years circling in his writing, something he called, in various ways, the price of becoming. The idea is this: the further you travel from who you used to be, the more certain people in your life will start to treat your progress as a personal offense, because you haven't stayed still. And in the architecture of herd psychology, moving forward when others aren't, that is its own kind of provocation. We're going to walk through 7 mechanisms today. 7 specific ways that authentic growth generates friction from the people around you. Some of them will feel immediately familiar. One of them, the final one, is going to reframe something you thought you understood about the people who've pulled away from you. Stay with me until we get there, because that last mechanism is the one that actually changes how you carry this. But before we reach the 7th, we need to start at the beginning, with something that happened in a lab in 1951 that revealed something quietly devastating about what groups do to people who insist on being right. Because the paradox of excellence isn't just a feeling, it has a mechanism, it has a history. And once you see it clearly, you stop mistaking it for a wound. If this kind of thinking resonates with you, subscribe. There's a lot more where this is coming from. So let's go to that lab. 1951. A psychologist named Solomon Asch sits a group of people around a table and shows them a simple card, 3 lines of different lengths, labeled A, B, and C. Then he shows them a 4th line and asks which of the 3 it matches. The answer is obvious. You could see it from across the room. But here's the thing. Most people at the table are actors, and one by one, they confidently give the wrong answer. What Asch found, and what still sits uncomfortably with most people when they hear it, is that a significant majority of real participants eventually went along with the group. They said the wrong answer out loud, in a room full of strangers, even though their own eyes told them differently. Not because they were confused, because the social pressure of disagreeing felt, in that moment, more threatening than being wrong. Now hold that image, because it has everything to do with what happens to you when you start growing. When you work on yourself, when you get more disciplined, more focused, more honest about what you want, you are, in the language of that experiment, giving a different answer than the room. You're just accurate. But accuracy, when it contradicts the group's established answer, feels like a challenge, and groups don't respond well to being challenged. This is the first mechanism. Visibility is a provocation, not because you've said anything, but because your progress makes the group's wrong answer harder to ignore. Nietzsche understood this dynamic deeply. He wrote, in essence, that the exceptional individual doesn't become a target because of what they've done, but because of what they've made undeniable. Your growth doesn't argue with anyone. It just stands there, quiet and visible, like a line on a card that everyone agreed to misread. And here's what makes this harder. The sharpest friction rarely comes from strangers. It comes from the people who were once closest to you. That's the second mechanism, and it's the one that tends to hurt the most. Not because the friction is more intense, but because it comes from a direction you didn't think to guard. Think about how we actually measure ourselves against the people we consider our equals, our coworkers, our old friends, the people who started from the same place we did, around the same time, with roughly the same hand of cards. That comparison is the thing. As long as you stay close, same habits, same ceiling, same unspoken agreements about what's possible, the relationship feels balanced, comfortable, safe. But the moment you start pulling away from that shared baseline, something shifts. You've just changed. And to the person still standing at the starting line, that gap doesn't feel like your progress. It feels like a verdict about them. This is what researchers in organizational psychology have been documenting for years. High performers are disproportionately targeted by what the field calls social undermining, Deliberate, often subtle behavior from peers designed to chip away at someone's confidence and standing. Quiet things, the credit that doesn't get passed along, the meeting scheduled without you, the slight reframe of your achievement that makes it sound a little smaller than it was. And here's what's worth sitting with. This behavior isn't usually conscious. The person doing it has just started feeling a pressure they can't name, and the pressure comes out sideways. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He wrote that the stronger an individual's direction becomes, the more it disturbs the people who have not yet found their own. Not because strength is offensive in itself, but because it illuminates, by contrast, the places where others have gone quiet. That illumination is uncomfortable, and discomfort, when it has nowhere to go, tends to find a target. Now, Nietzsche had a specific name for what fuels this kind of pressure, and it isn't jealousy. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Jealousy is relatively clean. Jealousy says, "I want what you have." There's a kind of honesty in it, even when it's uncomfortable. But what Nietzsche identified, what he called ressentiment, is something darker and more self-deceiving than that. It's what happens when frustrated desire goes unacknowledged long enough that it curdles. The person stops wanting what you have. They start needing to believe that what you have isn't worth wanting. So your discipline becomes arrogance in their telling. Your focus becomes coldness. Your results become luck or connections or some other convenient explanation that keeps their own inaction comfortable. They don't construct this consciously. That's what makes it so effective. As a defense mechanism, it runs quietly in the background, rewriting the story until it feels true. Nietzsche wrote in The Gay Science that exceptional individuals are routinely misread by the people surrounding them. Not because those people lack the capacity to understand, but because genuine understanding would cost them something. It would require admitting the distance between where they are and where they chose not to go. This is the third mechanism, and it's the one that explains why the friction you face rarely looks like what it actually is. It arrives disguised as a moral opinion about you, your attitude, your choices, the way you carry yourself. And because it sounds like feedback, you're tempted to take it seriously. Don't. Not because the people involved are bad, most aren't, but because what they're describing isn't you. It's the shape of their own unfinished business, reflected back and given your name. The weight of that realization tends to settle slowly, and once it does, something else shifts. A question that's been sitting quietly underneath all of this starts to rise to the surface. If the hostility isn't really about who you are, what exactly is it about? It's about something older than any individual relationship. Something closer to instinct than to choice. Here's what I mean. Human beings didn't evolve as lone creatures. For most of our history, the group was survival itself. Warmth, food, protection, everything. And in that context, someone who behaved differently from the group wasn't just unusual. They were a potential liability, a variable that could get everyone killed. So we developed a deep, almost physical sensitivity to deviation. We learned to notice it, feel uneasy about it, and, when it persisted, push back against it. That wiring hasn't gone anywhere. It's just been repurposed. Now it fires not at someone carrying a different kind of spear, but at someone with a different kind of schedule, a different set of standards, a different answer to the question of what a life should look like. The person who declines the after-work drinks because they're training for something. The one who sets a boundary in an environment that runs on shared complaints. The one who stops participating in the low-grade pessimism that a group has mistaken for realism. None of those things are provocations, but they register as disruptions to the group's equilibrium, to its unspoken agreements, to the comfortable fiction that the ceiling everyone shares is the actual ceiling. This is what Nietzsche pointed to when he described herd psychology, the group's instinct to regulate itself by pulling outliers back toward the center. Not out of malice, but out of something more primitive, the need for the shape of the group to hold. And the person growing isn't trying to break that shape, they're just outgrowing it, quietly, without asking permission. Which raises the question nobody in that group wants to ask themselves openly. If someone can grow, why haven't we? That question lives in the room even when nobody says it, and the discomfort it creates has to land somewhere. Most of the time, it lands on you. And when it lands on you consistently, as a pattern, something interesting starts to happen inside you. Something more dangerous than the friction itself. The fifth mechanism is the one that does the most quiet damage. Just a slow accumulation of small things that individually seem almost too minor to mention. The meeting you weren't told about. The achievement acknowledged so briefly, it might as well not have been. The steady reframing of your efforts as something slightly less than they are. Ambitious repackaged as difficult. Focused repackaged as distant. Growing repackaged as changed. None of it leaves a mark you can point to. That's exactly the problem. Organizational psychology has a name for this: social undermining. And what the research shows is that sustained, low-grade friction like this is often more corrosive than open conflict, precisely because it offers nothing solid to push back against, just atmosphere. A room that runs a degree or two colder than it should whenever you walk in. And here's the part nobody warns you about. Given enough time in that atmosphere, the doubt starts sounding like your own voice. The exhaustion starts to feel like evidence. You begin to wonder whether you've miscalculated, whether the gap between you and the group is your fault, your flaw, your arrogance. This is the point where social leveling does its most effective work, when it's subtle enough that you start enforcing it on yourself. Nietzsche would have recognized this instantly. He believed the most sophisticated threat to a person's development isn't external opposition. It's the moment that opposition gets internalized. The moment the growing person starts shrinking to make the room feel warmer. That moment, that specific pivot, is what everything we've covered so far has been building toward. Because what you decide at that moment doesn't just affect the relationship, or the job, or the group. It determines something much larger than any of those things. What it determines is whether you exist on your own terms or on the group's. And this is where Nietzsche becomes most useful. And most uncomfortable. Because he didn't offer comfort in the conventional sense. He didn't say the rejection would stop, or that the people around you would eventually come around. What he argued, across his writing, again and again, is that authentic becoming requires passing through exactly this kind of pressure. Not despite the resistance, through it. He described periods of necessary solitude not as failures of connection, but as structural requirements of genuine self-development. The person who has never been willing to stand in a room that's gone quiet around them has never really been tested. They've only ever been comfortable. Think about what that means for you, practically. The cold shoulder from someone you respected. The version of yourself that others keep insisting is the true one, smaller, safer, easier to be around. The drip of comments that, taken individually, mean nothing, but taken together have been slowly building a case for you to retreat. All of that is the test, the path itself. Nietzsche wrote that a person begins to find their actual direction at precisely the moment the crowd stops being able to follow. When they first feel the pull to turn back and choose not to. That choice doesn't look heroic from the inside. It feels like stubbornness or loneliness or both. The room is still cold. The messages are still sparse. Nothing has changed visibly, but something has shifted in how you're holding yourself inside it all. And that shift is the sixth mechanism working in your favor. Solitude as the specific condition under which an authentic direction becomes clear. The question is what you do with the clarity once you have it. Because here's what almost nobody anticipates. The nature of the friction doesn't disappear when you stop shrinking. It changes shape. And its new shape is the strangest thing of all. The new shape is attention. Obsessive, detailed, weirdly consistent attention. You've probably noticed this already, even if you haven't named it. The person who claims indifference but somehow always knows what you've been doing. Who references your choices in conversations where your name shouldn't logically have come up. Who tracks, comments, circles back, not occasionally, but with a regularity that doesn't match the story they tell about not caring. Here's the seventh mechanism, and it's the most counterintuitive one we've covered. The hostility that sustains itself over time, that stays specific and detailed and personally calibrated to you, is fascination. Redirected, frustrated, unable to admit its own nature, but fascination nonetheless. Genuine disinterest doesn't produce that much energy. It doesn't require that much maintenance. Real indifference is quiet. What you're looking at when someone's opposition to you becomes almost like a project they're running is something closer to preoccupation. And preoccupation doesn't arise toward people who don't matter. Nietzsche understood this dynamic as one of the most revealing features of how people process their own unlived possibilities. The person who watches you most closely, who monitors the thing you're building from a careful, critical distance, is often the one most aware, however unwillingly, of what you represent to them. Not what you've done to them, what you've shown them about themselves. This doesn't mean you should feel smug about it. That's not the point, and Nietzsche wouldn't have had much patience for smugness either. The point is simpler and more useful. Their ceiling height reaction is a function of your floor. The intensity of someone's opposition to your growth is, in many cases, a rough measurement of how far you've moved. Which means the question to stop asking is, why are they like this toward me? The question worth sitting with is altogether different. And it leads us directly to the only thing left to address. What do you actually do with all of this? What you do with it is not what most people expect to hear. The instinct, once you understand these 7 mechanisms, is to use them as armor, to feel justified, to hold the framework up like a shield every time someone's reaction stings, to tell yourself, that's just ressentiment, that's just the herd reflex, that's just preoccupation disguised as criticism. And look, some of that is genuinely useful. Understanding the machinery does reduce the sting. But Nietzsche's actual instruction was sharper than that. He was interested in what a person does next. His argument, running through his writing like a current, was that a life spent managing how others perceive you is not a life you're actually living. It's a performance you're maintaining. And the tragedy isn't that the audience never fully approves, it's that the performer, given enough time, forgets there was ever anything underneath the performance to begin with. So what he would tell you is this: don't manage the friction. Don't explain yourself to it. Don't rearrange your edges to reduce it. The authentic response to opposition isn't to become harder or more defensive or more strategic about your image. It's simpler and more demanding than any of those things. Continue becoming. That's it. Continue. With clarity about what you're building and why it matters to you. Not why it should impress anyone, not why it will eventually be recognized, but why it matters to you, specifically, at the level where your choices are made before anyone else is watching. Research on social undermining shows it works most effectively on people who haven't yet decided who they are. The antidote isn't thicker skin, it's a clearer sense of direction. When you know what you're moving toward, the opposition stops feeling like a verdict and starts feeling like weather. Unpleasant sometimes, not decisive. Nietzsche called this self-overcoming, the ongoing, unglamorous work of choosing your direction again, each morning, regardless of what the room did yesterday. There's one thing left to say about all of this, and it's the thing I promised you at the start. So let's go back to where we started, that room you know well. The one that went a few degrees colder without explanation. The group chat that thinned out. The colleagues who used to include you and quietly stopped. You did everything right, and somewhere along the way, the warmth just drained out of certain relationships, like water through open hands. Here's what we now know about that room. The coolness was a reaction. 7 distinct mechanisms, each one running on its own fuel. The visibility that provokes, the proximity that amplifies, the frustrated desire that curdles into moral judgment, the ancient herd reflex misfiring at behavioral deviation, the slow drip of ambient erosion, the necessary solitude of a direction becoming clear, and finally, the obsessive attention that masquerades as indifference, but is, underneath, the most unwilling form of acknowledgement a person can offer. Every mechanism we walked through points to the same underlying truth. The paradox of excellence. The strange, reliable way that genuine growth generates irrational friction from the people closest to it is not a malfunction of human nature. It is human nature, doing exactly what it was built to do. And once you see the wiring, you stop mistaking the current for a personal verdict about your worth. Nietzsche spent his life arguing that the measure of a person's authentic direction is not the ease with which others follow. It's the specific quality of the resistance they generate. Small movement produces small friction. The resistance you've been feeling has a size. Notice what size it is. You walked into this video carrying a room that had gone cold. The room hasn't changed, but the way you're standing in it just did. The cold air is still there. You're just not interpreting it as evidence against yourself anymore. If something in this landed for you, drop it in the comments. And if you want to keep thinking this way, there's more here waiting for you.